Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, Kel, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. Kapowsin, Washington, July 18, 1998. A single wide on a quiet road, midday light through thin curtains, patrol seals the doorway, then we step in behind the camera. One living room, one victim, one scene that explains too much. The woman on the couch is identified as Lisa Ann Dom Carlson, 27, mother of twins. The visual is controlled, even deliberate. Valuables in plain sight. No pry marks on the door, no drawers dumped. The space looks staged to suggest a sexual attack, but the evidence patterns are wrong for a break-in or a robbery that turned violent. Technicians work the floor first. Photographs in sequence. Trajectory rods to confirm angles. 3 gunshot wounds are documented. The spacing and impact characteristics suggest a small caliber weapon, consistent with .22 class ammunition. Blood distribution supports that Lisa was shot here, not killed elsewhere and moved. There is no broad sweep of chaos you'd expect from a frenzied assault. Instead, controlled placement and limited disturbance. In places like Kapowsin, murders aren't just crimes. They tear at a quiet town's sense of order. Here, the order itself is suspicious. The checklist continues. Fingernail scrapings, hair and fiber lifts from upholstery and throw blankets. Latent prints dusted on hard surfaces that a stranger would reasonably touch. Door hardware, entertainment unit, kitchen entry. Evidence texts note what is present. Prints, smears, partials, and what's conspicuously absent for an unknown offender scenario. Exterior doors and windows show no forced entry. Screens are intact. A quick inventory confirms jewelry and electronics remain. If the motive were theft or opportunistic assault, the pattern should look different. Medical examiners take custody. A tight shot log records the positions of the body, the orientation of limbs, and any indications of post-mortem handling. The sexualized tableau is documented with minimal language, enough to explain the inference without exploiting the image. The working hypothesis is not who, but why this presentation. Staging is a second act of violence. It misdirects investigators, reframes a victim's reputation, and aims to control the narrative of how and why she died. Detectives begin the clock. They lock down verified times, who last saw Lisa alive, who called, who had scheduled contact. Neighbors report normal activity earlier in the day. No loud struggle, no vehicle screeching away. The sound profile of small caliber fire can be missed in daytime ambient noise. So absence of a loud gunshot report is not exculpatory for anyone. The first data requests are routine: phone logs, answering machine tapes, recent emails if available, work schedules for relevant parties. The team will compare those artifacts to the physical evidence we see here. One line goes up on the case board: the rooms telling a story. The problem, investigators note, is that the story aligns too neatly with a stranger narrative, the very narrative the physical facts undercut. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. Chapter by chapter, we will test competing explanations against the record, the wound paths, the entry points that weren't forced, the items that weren't taken, and any message traffic that tried to move Lisa's voice after she could no longer speak. Lisa Ann Dom Carlson was 27, the mother of twins, and, according to multiple sources close to her, moving toward a separation in mid-July 1998. Detectives began here because victimology defines motive corridors. The team mapped her last weeks: child care pickups, brief shifts, errands logged by receipts, and routine calls with friends who described a woman trying to reset her life. No biography, just patterns. Those patterns would anchor what happens next. The baseline routine was stable. Lisa handled morning prep for the twins, divided afternoons with help from relatives, and managed short runs to a nearby store, transactions that generated time-stamped slips. She kept a modest schedule, not the aimless movement that complicates timelines. Investigators collected her phone records and answering machine tapes to build a contact lattice. Who she called, who called her, and which messages were saved or missing. The expectation in a domestic homicide inquiry is that changes in routine show up right before the event. New appointments, sudden cancellations, odd gaps. The case notes flagged 2, a narrow midday window with no confirmed outside contact, and a plan mentioned to a friend earlier that week to discuss living arrangements away from her current home. Control dynamics surfaced early, treated as statements to be tested rather than conclusions. Friends referenced conflict, monitoring, and tension around parenting decisions. Detectives did not weigh character, they weighed risk factors. A planned separation in a household with small children introduces custody stakes. When custody becomes part of a conflict, the timeline usually tightens around days when logistics are in flux, packing, childcare handoffs, or meetings about next steps. That made the week before July 18th a priority for corroboration. The team requested calendars, school notes, pediatric appointments, and any written exchanges that might authenticate Lisa's intentions. Nothing in Lisa's financials indicated a sudden windfall or debt crisis. She had no pending court dates for unrelated matters. She was not known to frequent bars late at night, nor did she have patterns that draw stranger risk. No dating apps, no new online contacts, no travel to unfamiliar areas. Investigators documented these negative findings because they pointed away from random predators and toward people already inside her orbit. In quiet communities, most homicides start within a narrow social ring. That is not bias, it is statistical reality and casework experience. Still, the team kept an open lane for outliers until evidence closed it. Digital fragments raised the first procedural question. The answering machine contained messages with timestamps close to the estimated time of death. A friend recalled leaving one that never appeared. Another contact believed a message they heard at the house later sounded different in order and content. Those observations are not evidence by themselves. They are leads. The plan was straightforward. Pull original tapes, document copy chains, and compare the physical machine's internal clock to actual time. Where possible, match message content to caller ID records or phone company logs, what was recorded versus what the carrier says happened. If any email claims existed, she sent this or she wrote that, they would be tested next against access locations and device custody. The rule is simple. Proof first, story second. Lisa's last verifiable day looked ordinary. Groceries, childcare coordination, a small stack of household tasks. She did not report threats to law enforcement that week. She did, however, confide that she was preparing to leave. Detectives handled that disclosure with care. It was logged as a statement requiring support from independent artifacts, notes, bags packed, items moved, calls to landlords, or relatives offering space. The team canvassed for witnesses who had seen boxes, suitcases, or changes in the twins' routine. They asked specific, narrow questions to avoid memory contamination: date, time, what was carried, who was present. Answers would be measured against receipts and traffic logs. The question of custody surfaced in more than one interview. It is a common stressor in separations and a known accelerant in domestic violence cases. Investigators did not let that theme drive their conclusions, but they acknowledged its weight when cross-checking timelines. A credible plan to relocate with children often generates a predictable burst of activity. Calls to relatives, paperwork, and appointments. Those signals were faint but present. If the scene at the house was built to mislead, the motive to mislead would likely be to bury a domestic conflict under the appearance of a sexual crime. The team avoided that leap. They wrote it as a hypothesis to be evaluated by the physical and digital record. One line from the log captured the mindset. The data that mattered most was not the dramatic claim, but the small confirmation. A timestamp that matched a receipt, a neighbor's consistent citing, a voicemail that held up under forensic playback. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. If someone tried to choreograph Lisa's voice after death, the machine would show it in micro errors, clock drift, sequence anomalies, edits audible under spectrum analysis. That was the next assignment. The evidence work began where it always should. Measure before meaning. Scene techs re-entered the Kapowsin living room with a fixed sequence: photograph, mark, recover, log, the couch position, the throw blanket, the angle of the coffee table relative to the doorway. Each item was captured once and only once to prevent later reinterpretation. 3 projectile injuries were recorded on Lisa Ann Dom Carlson. The distribution and wound characteristics pointed to a small caliber firearm, consistent with .22 class ammunition. No contact burning was documented at the edges of the wounds. That detail matters because it frames distance. The medical examiner's preliminary note, no dramatic soot imprint, no tearing consistent with a close muzzle, suggested the shooter was not pressed against the victim at discharge. That is a procedural clue, not a conclusion about identity. The room lacked the abrasion you see when a stranger forces entry and fights for control. Cabinet fronts were undisturbed. Drawers showed normal alignment. Jewelry and electronics were present. Doors and window frames bore no new pry marks or screw lift. Exterior screens were intact. Even the dust prints near the entry ran consistent with household use. Investigators called this negative evidence, not what was there, but what should have been there if the narrative were an intrusion, a sexual assault, then murder. When a claim points one direction and the room points another, the room wins. A short test sweep for latent prints focused on surfaces a true outsider tends to touch: door hardware, light switches near the living area, the TV stand. Results were limited and typical for a residence. Partials were logged, photographed, lifted, and submitted. Nothing about those early lifts suggested a new, unknown hand moved through the space in force during the window relevant to the homicide. That does not eliminate an outsider. It sets a burden for any later defense theory that relies on one. Blood pattern analysis stayed conservative. Spatter consistent with small caliber impact was present, but the distribution was contained. The couch absorbed much of the back spatter and cast off. There was no highway of transfer across the floor that would indicate a prolonged fight from room to room. No long wipe trails from a dragged body. A few small transfers on fabric told investigators something else. The body was positioned with intent after death. That observation aligned with what was obvious to the naked eye, the sexualized staging. But it was recorded in clinical terms to keep the case file precise and admissible. The front door frame and lock set were photographed under raking light. Paint breaks and compression patterns were consistent with normal use. A burglary that escalates to homicide generally leaves scars: tool marks, kick jams, misaligned strike plates. Those signatures weren't present. A later daytime walk-around of the structure logged ground. Disturbance near windows. The soil and needle bed didn't show fresh, compressed channels or scraping typical of someone testing screens. Again, negative evidence is still evidence. Inside, clock references were captured: the microwave display, the VCR clock, the answering machine's internal timestamp. None serve as official time, but all help the lab reconcile when recordings occurred compared to carrier logs. If any message was left after the estimated time of death, that will show in the mismatch between a machine's drift and the phone company's record. The team preserved the answering machine in place, then bagged and boxed it for controlled playback later. The idea was simple: build a chain that can survive court, then let the data live or die under forensic review. The autopsy plan matched the scene plan. Document, then test. Trajectory estimates from the living room would be compared against wound paths and projectile recovery. Small caliber rounds may deform or fragment. When recoverable, they provide class characteristics and rifling impressions if the barrel leaves them. If the rounds cannot be matched to a specific weapon, They still anchor the caliber range. That range helps exclude certain guns if one is later produced. It also helps explain why nearby neighbors may not have reported hearing sharp, explosive sounds. 22 class discharges in daytime ambient noise are often missed. Techs log textile evidence from the couch and clothing. Fabric distortion can show whether a body was repositioned or dressed after death. The finding here was narrow but important. The alignment of fabric stress with blood saturation suggested the staging occurred after the fatal event, not during it. That matters because it clarifies motive mechanics. Staging is not about overpowering a victim. It is about controlling what investigators think when they walk in. From a procedural standpoint, nothing collected on day one identified a killer. It did narrow the universe of plausible stories. The scene acted like a domestic homicide, presented as something else. Investigators kept their language tight. No editorial lines, no narrative leaps. A single note in the log summarized the posture going forward. If this was an intruder, the intruder did not steal, did not force entry, did not wander, and did not leave the room the way intruders usually do. That is a claim the evidence does not currently support. For viewers who follow this type of work, the value is in the order of operations. We do not guess first and fit the room second. We let the room speak, then compare it to the messages, the phone logs, and the alibis that will arrive in interviews. In quiet communities, a single manipulated detail can bend public opinion for years. The job is to put every claim beside a measurable fact and see which fails first. The investigation moved from carpet and fabric to plastic and tape. Detectives signed out the answering machine from Lisa Ann Dom Carlson's living room and transferred it to a controlled lab. Chain of custody was logged at each handoff. No dramatics, just a promise that whatever the device revealed could stand up in court. The goal was to test a simple claim made by more than one acquaintance. Certain messages didn't sound right in order or timing. In cases like this, you don't start by guessing who edited what. You start by asking what the machine can prove and what the phone company can confirm. A clean playback was prepared. The machine's internal clock was photographed, then recorded at the start of the session. Technicians captured the tape's audio into a digital file, so every click, gap, and tone could be measured down to the fraction of a second. Separately, investigators served lawful requests for the carrier's call detail records: time, duration, originating number. Internal clocks on consumer devices drift. Carrier clocks don't. That contrast is the first filter for distinguishing normal household use from deliberate manipulation. On first listen, the message stack seemed ordinary, a few short check-ins, a routine reminder, nothing frantic. What mattered wasn't tone, it was sequence. The machine reported timestamps that, when corrected for its clock drift, partially overlapped with the estimated time of death. That alone is not suspicious. People leave messages without knowing anything is wrong. But one friend reported a message she left mid-afternoon that never appeared in the saved queue. The carrier log showed her call connected and lasted the right number of seconds to match a standard message. The machine did not hold it. Either it never recorded, it was erased, or it was recorded and then replaced by another message. The lab used a simple method to test for tampering without overpromising. Examine the pattern of cue and record clicks on the tape. Many home units leave faint impressions, tiny mechanical signatures, whenever a user stops, rewinds, or re-records across a section. Over time, normal use produces an even rhythm. In one portion covering the hours around the midday window, those impressions broke that rhythm. Start, stop, backtrack. Then a second start that didn't match the way this household usually handled voicemails. The machine itself can't tell you who touched it. It can tell you that someone did more than press play. The next check matched message content against carrier times. When the machine announced 3:12 p.m. for a call from a known contact, The carrier placed that contact's call at 2:58 p.m. Pacific. The device's clock was off by 14 minutes, which is typical. The correction factor was applied to the entire tape. Most messages landed within a reasonable margin. 2 did not. One message the machine claimed was before another now fell after it, once drift was corrected. That reversal is not a software trick. This was an analog deck. The only way order changes on tape is manual intervention. There was also the question of call screening. Some machines let users listen live and delete in real time. If someone screened a message and killed it, the carrier would still show a completed call while the machine kept no saved artifact. That is lawful household behavior. But it becomes probative if the screened and deleted call contains content investigators can independently verify, like a person referencing a plan that contradicts a preferred narrative. Detectives reached back out to the friend whose message was missing. Her recollection matched what the carrier logged for duration. She said she confirmed a detail Lisa had discussed earlier that week about living arrangements. The investigation did not rely on memory alone. That recollection simply guided the next steps. Check for any paperwork, inquiries, or calls that could support the claim. One additional audio anomaly mattered. Under spectrum view, a short segment near the time of death showed a non-voice spike, a mechanical artifact consistent with a stop-rewind record operation. You don't build a case on that alone, but in context, staging at the scene, and a disputed message count, it adds weight to a theory that the timeline was being groomed after Lisa was no longer able to place or receive calls. In towns where people still depend on landlines, the answering machine becomes a kind of witness, not reliable for who, very strong for when. Investigators then compared all this against who had practical access to the device during the critical window. That list was short. The house wasn't ransacked. There wasn't a trail of a stranger wandering through, and there was no forced entry. Access by family or someone known to the household was straightforward and required no tools. That observation is narrow and procedural. It doesn't convict anyone. It tells you where to focus interviews and alibi checks. The cross-check moved to outbound activity. If a person used the house line to call a mobile or a workplace to set up an alibi, the carrier would show it. If someone tried to make it look like Lisa was alive after the estimated time of death by placing a call from the house phone to her own contacts, that would show too. The record did not reveal a burst of outgoing calls from the house at the exact time you'd expect if someone were impersonating her voice. That doesn't disprove manipulation. It narrows how it could have been done, less likely through outgoing calls, more likely through message handling and selective deletion. One line in the case log captured the pivot. If the room was designed to mislead, the machine was designed to reassure. It reassured the wrong story. That's the kind of misstep that happens when someone tries to tidy up evidence they don't fully understand. A person can move furniture. It's harder to fake the linear truth of a recording medium and the independent truth of a carrier database. When those two disagree, investigators tend to side with the clock that doesn't depend on a household button. There's a human side to this that doesn't need sentiment, just respect. People called because they cared about Lisa and the twins. Those messages, in their ordinary words, now carried the burden of actual proof. That's not fair to the callers, but it's often how these cases are solved. One small routine act becomes the anchor that resists a lie. With the answering machine locked down and the carrier records in hand, the case shifted to people who had access, who had motive pressure, and whose timeline held up under the digital clock. Interviews began with the inner ring around Lisa Ann Dom Carlson. Detectives kept the scope narrow, confirm routine, verify last contacts, identify custody concerns in the days before July 18, 1998. Friends described a woman organizing her next step. This was not speculation. It came with bits investigators could test, mentions of looking for housing, asking about childcare help, and setting aside essentials for the twins. The goal wasn't to prove a separation by opinion. It was to find artifacts that stand up: a name in a day planner, a call to a relative offering temporary space, a note about timing. As those items surfaced, the interviews returned to the same pressure point: the children. Any change in Lisa's living situation meant a change in custody, and that is where otherwise ordinary conflicts tend to escalate. The immediate family was asked to account for the early afternoon window. Questions were short and identical across subjects. Where were you? Who can confirm it? And did you access the house phone or answering machine that day? Detectives logged not just the answers, but the order in which details were volunteered. Inconsistent narrators often over-explain the parts they view as risky. One account leaned heavily on exact times without independent anchors. Another minimized access to the house, even though access would have been routine. That inconsistency doesn't prove intent. It identifies where to probe with records. Next, the team compared alibis to infrastructure. Work logs were pulled where available. Time cards are imperfect but better than memory. Drive times were plotted for the relevant addresses under midday traffic conditions, then padded for conservative error. The question wasn't whether someone could theoretically move between two places. It was whether the stated movements matched the possible ones inside the homicide window. In one case, the claimed stop-by-stop sequence left only minutes to spare. Yet the answering machine anomalies suggested the device was handled more than once. Those two realities could fit together, but only if the person asserting the tight timeline had immediate access and opportunity. Detectives also tracked language about Lisa's state of mind. In several interviews, a similar phrase appeared, casting doubt on her reliability or mood. Repetition like that can originate from truth or from rehearsal. To avoid bias, investigators mapped those phrases against independent evidence. Did Lisa schedule childcare? Did she move funds? Did she call a landlord or family member to discuss living arrangements? Where the answer was yes, the claim that she was not planning or not stable lost force. As the interviews deepened, the custody theme kept returning. That required care. Police don't determine custody. They investigate homicide. The relevance here was motive mechanics. If someone believed they were about to lose daily access to the twins, would they try to reframe a domestic crisis as a sexual crime by a stranger? The scene facts from earlier, no forced entry, no theft, controlled presentation, made that theory logical to test. Still, the team treated it as a hypothesis to be proven by evidence, not a conclusion to fill with speculation. A second wave of interviews focused on communications. Who used the household phone regularly? Who knew the answering machine's functions? Had anyone ever deleted a message during live screening? These aren't trick questions. In many families, more than one person manages voicemails. But when a friend's call appears on the carrier log and not on the saved tape, the people who had access become central, and their claims must align with the machine's mechanical signatures. Two interviewees gave reasonable explanations for routine deletions in prior weeks. Neither explanation covered the stop-rewind record pattern in the specific midday window. Investigators also reconciled statements about the twins' schedule. Drop-off and pickup times form a backbone in cases like this because children's routines are harder to manipulate after the fact. Too many adults keep track. Parents, grandparents, neighbors, and sitters were asked to anchor the times they saw the children that week, not how they felt about the household dynamic. The aim was to freeze the day into verifiable blocks and see who intersected the house when the answering machine timeline shifted. One subtle shift in posture happened as these interviews built up. The narrative about an outside threat faded. No one reported a stranger hanging around. No forced entry, no ransack, no theft, and now no credible story about an intruder making contact with the family in the hours before the murder. That doesn't end a theory, but it starves it. Meanwhile, the story about a separation gathered artifacts, and artifacts win over claims. In towns like Kapausen, people tend to know each other's routines. They remember the out-of-place details. None of those neighbors placed a suspicious visitor at Lisa's door. A final pass through this round of interviews addressed access to the answering machine after discovery. Who entered the house, who remained inside, and who handled phones or devices before police sealed the scene. The chain of events after death can contaminate evidence if it's not documented. In this case, the record showed limited post-discovery handling. That made the pre-discovery manipulations more telling. Whoever adjusted the message order or removed a call did so before law enforcement control. The takeaway was not dramatic. It was cumulative. Interviews narrowed the field to people who, 1, had routine access, 2, had knowledge or use of the answering machine, 3, had a reason to prefer a stranger narrative, and 4, had timelines that strained against the combined physical and digital record. That is how domestic homicide cases typically sharpen, not with a single confession, but with conflicts that only resolve when the truth is the last version left standing. This part of the story carries a quiet human note. Friends stepped forward because they wanted Lisa's last week documented accurately. Their memories matched to receipts and logs formed a straight line through noise that someone tried to create. In a case built around staging, ordinary people telling what they did at ordinary times was the correction. To move this case forward, detectives turned the day of July 18, 1998 into blocks they could defend in court. They laid the corrected answering machine sequence beside phone company logs, then overlaid both on what witnesses and work records said. The result wasn't guesswork. It was a workable clock. Morning hours showed routine, childcare prep, short household tasks, nothing irregular documented by neighbors or contacts. Late morning into early afternoon, the record thinned. That gap mattered because it overlapped the estimated window of death, established from scene findings, and the medical examiner's early estimate. Rather than repeat those details, investigators treated the window as fixed and asked a simpler question: who could have entered, acted, and left within that slice of time? They built travel profiles for every person with ordinary access to the home. Each route was clocked in real conditions: midday traffic, average speeds, reasonable parking, and walk-up times. Stops that interviewees described were mapped to receipts where they existed and to carrier logs when a call supposedly occurred on the way. When a claimed 5-minute errand routinely takes 11, that variance gets written down. When a person places themselves across town minutes before a message on Lisa's machine should have been handled, that contradiction doesn't resolve by opinion. It resolves by math. The corrected tape order created the first hard edge. A friend's call that the carrier shows connecting mid-afternoon never appears among the saved messages. Around that same segment of tape, the lab documented a stop-rewind record pattern. Again, the device cannot identify hands, but it proved adjustment. Investigators then asked who, according to interviews, was in proximity to the house and not fully accounted for in those minutes. One alibi leaned on precise times without anchors. No receipt, no outside witness, no workplace clock-in. By itself, that is not disqualifying. Set against the machine's mechanical signatures, it became a pressure point. Neighbors filled in outer fences. Several were outside with normal weekend activity. None reported vehicles they didn't recognize pulling up during the key window. That silence doesn't prove anything alone. It simply makes the outsider scenario harder to maintain. In small communities, unfamiliar cars draw attention. Here, the roadway memory stayed ordinary. Detectives then reconstructed a plausible minute stack for actions inside the home. Entry without forced damage is seconds. A confrontation, 3 shots from a small caliber weapon, and immediate post-event handling, minutes, not an hour. Post-mortem posing adds more minutes. Manipulating the answering machine adds minutes again, especially if a person is trying to manage order, not just playback. The line they wrote in the case log was plain. The total operational time required to stage the room and curate the machine fits within the midday gap only if the actor already knew the layout, the victim's routine, and the device. The twins' schedule added another fixed post. Children were seen by more than one adult, at times bracketing the homicide window. That stabilized pickup and drop-off accounts and limited who could have been free to move at the exact hour the machine shows tampering. When one interview tried to place a necessary errand on top of a childcare duty, logged by another adult, the two timelines competed. Investigators sided with the entry that had an independent witness. Outbound calling from the house line in that window remained low. That pushed the theory away from impersonating Lisa by phone and toward rearranging what callers would hear later, a simpler and less risky operation. When detectives re-asked who understood the answering machine well enough to screen, delete, or re-record, the list was short and unsurprising. Access in a household is not exotic, it's normal. But in a homicide, normal access becomes opportunity measured against minutes. This is where the timeline moved from soft to hard. The team produced a table, minute marks, notations, and sources, neighbor sightings, carrier timestamps, receipt times, and the tape's corrected order with mechanical anomalies. They circled the 5 to 15 minute span that had to contain both the homicide and the alterations. The people who could occupy that span, by their own statements and the records, narrowed, not to one name yet, to a small set that would face tighter questions. There's a practical human note here. Ordinary life leaves ordinary footprints. Store slips, a neighbor's glance, a time card punch. Staging tries to overwrite that truth. Timelines put it back. When evidence aligns this cleanly, investigators don't celebrate. They test the hardest contradiction they can find. If it holds, the case advances to charging decisions. If it breaks, they adjust. In Kapowsin, the timeline held. By the time this case reached a Pierce County courtroom, the file was lean and organized. One homicide scene in Kapowsin, July 18, 1998, 3 small caliber gunshot wounds, valuables left, no forced entry, a presentation investigators read as post-mortem staging. Prosecutors built on that spine and told jurors the simplest version of a hard story. This was a domestic killing disguised as a sexual crime. They argued opportunity sat inside the home circle and motive sharpened around Lisa Ann Dom Carlson's plan to leave with the twins. Jurors first saw the living room sequence in photos and measurements, positions, trajectories, and the absence of the chaos you expect when an unknown assailant fights through a burglary or an attack. The state's experts stayed inside the lines, no dramatics, explaining why the physical room contradicted an intruder narrative. Then the digital work came in. The answering machine's corrected timeline was paired with carrier records to show order irregularities and at least one missing message that a friend remembered leaving mid-afternoon. The lab's notation of stop rewind record behavior sat beside interview transcripts describing who used that machine and how. The point wasn't to name hands, it was to prove manipulation during the narrow window when Lisa could no longer place or receive calls. From there, the state walked jurors through routine becoming evidence. Child care anchors and neighbor observations bracketed the midday gap. Travel times and receipts tested alibis that sounded precise but lacked independent support. A prosecutor summed up the math without flourish. The time required to shoot, pose, and manage messages fits only if the actor knew the house and the device. In a quiet community, routine is your witness. Here, routine did not back a stranger. The defense pressed the weak points. They challenged the certainty around time of death, the interpretation of staging, and the reliability of consumer electronics used as clocks. They asked whether screened messages and deletions could be ordinary use. They raised reasonable doubt questions about who, when more than one person had lawful access to the home. On cross, they pushed experts to admit what the evidence could not do. It could not identify the person who pressed play, stop, or record. It could not read intent from a missing message. It could not make a timeline act like a fingerprint. Prosecutors answered by narrowing the claim. The state did not offer a miracle device. It offered a convergence. The room's story, the tape's corrected order, the carrier's neutral clock, the lack of outsider sightings at the critical hour, and the custody pressure point that gave someone close to Lisa a motive to reframe what happened. As one investigator put it later, you don't need every brick to match. You need the wall to stand. In this courtroom, the wall stood long enough. Closing arguments stayed within those boundaries. The state described a domestic homicide and a stage scene designed to humiliate Lisa and mislead the investigation. The defense told jurors the state had built suspicion on inferences and negative findings, not direct proof, and urged them to hold the line on reasonable doubt. After deliberations, the jury returned guilty verdicts. Sentences followed, substantial and consistent with first-degree murder findings at the time. No alternative ending was offered to jurors. Appeals would come later, as they do in serious cases, but the verdict in that room was unambiguous. There is a sober truth to trials like this. A courtroom cannot restore a life or erase the burden placed on a family. It can declare what the record supports. In 2003, that record supported guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The record didn't end in 2003. It had to be corrected. In 2006, Washington's appellate court reversed the convictions, not because the evidence was too thin, but because parts of the trial were tried the wrong way. Items that should have been suppressed were used. Confrontation rules were overstepped. State of mind hearsay came in too broadly. The court allowed a retrial. The facts stood. The method had to be cleaned. That ruling forced everyone back to the table. Prosecutors reevaluated what would be admissible the second time. Defense counsel weighed risk. The core spine remained intact from our earlier chapters. A midday window, a staged living room, a message stack with order manipulation carrier logs that didn't lie, and a domestic motive sharpened by a planned separation and custody stakes. What changed was the litigation terrain. Some exhibits would be trimmed. Some testimony would be narrower. With those constraints, the system did what it often does in serious homicides, pressed toward resolution without another multi-week trial. In 2008, there was one ending. Daniel Carlson pled guilty to second-degree murder and received 23 years. Carol Jean Carlson pled guilty to 3 counts of second-degree assault and 1 count of sexually violating human remains, receiving 9 years with credit. No alternate finale, no second story. The pleas recognized what the corrected record could still prove and closed the case under rules the appellate court endorsed. What did the outcome preserve? That Lisa Ann Dom Carlson was killed in her Kapowsin home on July 18, 1998. That the room was arranged after death to humiliate and mislead. That someone tried to manage her voice on an answering machine while the phone company's neutral clock fixed the truth. That custody pressure, paired with her plan to leave, was part of the context investigators tested and the evidence ultimately supported. The legal labels shifted between 2003 and 2008. The story did not. It became the same case told within corrected boundaries. There's a human line worth saying once and only once. Staging is a second act of harm. It aims to take dignity from a person who can't answer back. Here, procedure over time returned that dignity. Friends who left ordinary messages became crucial witnesses because ordinary life leaves reliable footprints. For families living with coercive control, that is the practical lesson. Document plans, keep records, tell someone early. Those small acts become anchors when someone tries to bend the narrative later. This is where we end. A homicide in 1998, guilty verdicts in 2003, a 2006 reversal that repaired the process, and in 2008, guilty pleas that fixed the result under law. One jurisdiction, Kapowsin, Pierce County, Washington. One victim, Lisa. One coherent resolution. No split timelines, no mixed endings. Just the case, steady from scene to sentence. I've walked you through Lisa's case as plainly as I know how. Here's what I take with me. Truth leaves tracks, receipts, calls, routines, and we honor victims by protecting those small proofs. If you're planning a hard change, document it. Tell someone and ask for help early. Due process can feel slow, but when done right, it gives dignity back. What did this story say to you about control, staging, and community responsibility? If this video reached you, drop a comment, where you're watching from, what you agree or disagree with, and share why. And if you want more cases told this way, please subscribe to the channel.